Hi, I'm historian and psychotherapist Andy Erdman, and this is Feel Familiar? Emotionally Intelligent History, a podcast where we look at important but sometimes little known or forgotten events and people from the past in order to better understand the present day. We'll also see how feelings, thoughts, fantasies, and ideas drive people to make history.
There's more to history than what you've been taught. History repeats, it may or may not. Time's got baggage, we all do. Erdman's here to walk us through what, when, where, how, who. Feel familiar? Crack the spine, a time's old script. We're diving in where the facts have slipped. It's history told with wit and care, with ghosts and guests, no thoughts to spare. Who, what, why, how, where. Feel familiar?
Hey folks, psychotherapist and historian Andy Erdman here. Has your country come down with a case of fascism? Or maybe it's your town or someone in your family. Maybe it's a comedian you used to sorta kinda like. Well, don't worry. We have a bonus episode of Feel Familiar? Emotionally Intelligent History with special guest Hannah Smith, therapist, author, and mental health educator. Listening to Hannah and I may feel like a soothing therapy session and help you feel a little less helpless. Hannah and I talk about culty thinking, what drives political mobs, like the one that tried to smash its way into the Astor Place Opera House in 1849, and how our brains can trick us into thinking we're in danger when we're not. So join us for this bonus episode, won't you? And don't worry, I'm hard at work on Season 2 of Feel Familiar, Emotionally Intelligent History. It's going to be a fun one.
Who, what, why, how, where. Feel familiar?
Hi, I'm Andy Erdman, and welcome to our bonus episode of Feel Familiar, Emotionally Intelligent History. I'm very excited today. We have a guest, Hannah Smith, and we're going to be talking about emotions and politics and society and culture and religion and lots of other things, dopamine and neurotransmitters and all kinds of interesting things. For those of you who are familiar with the podcast, the first season of Feel Familiar focused on the Astor Place theater riots of 1849, which was a major culture war, and it involved two different groups, not unlike sort of today's red and blue MAGA, non-MAGA split, both intensely vilifying and hating one another, and then federal troops opening fire on a crowd in New York City and killing a lot of innocent people. And sadly, we seem to be in a similar situation today. There are some key differences. And I'm really interested, both as a therapist and a historian, in looking at some of the underlying psychodynamics of what's going on in people's minds emotionally and affectively that result in or contribute to these political and social upheavals and the violence and the anger and all this stuff. And Hannah's going to help me explore that. We also have our wonderful producer, Joshua Dudley, who's in from New York. He's not in from New York. He's in New York. Is it totally freezing there, Joshua? Is everything just covered in snow?
It's covered in snow everywhere, and we haven't had a snow day in 4 years, and now every day is a snow day. But we got to do sledding in Central Park last weekend, 2 days in a row. So it's been a fun change of pace.
The words "every day is a snow day" made me like the happiest 7-year-old in the world. Hannah, how is it? You're up in the Northwest. You're up in Bellingham, up in Washington?
Close. I'm about 25 minutes south of Bellingham.
Okay. How is it up there? Or did you guys get hit by the cold snap, or are you sort of in your rainy
No, we're kind of the
fog?
opposite. We were noticing earlier today that the temperature outside was almost the temperature
Oh,
inside.
wow.
So it was like 66 outside and 67 inside. So it's quite warm for
For February.
February.
I know. We're getting hit with a warm snap. So welcome to weird climate weirdness. Okay.
Yes.
Hannah Smith, MA, LMHC, CGP, is the founder of the Potential Finders Network and its education branch, the Village Education and Growth Collective. She's an author. She has written the wonderful book, Lasting Change. The subtitle is Overcoming the Grip of Anxiety, Depression, and Trauma with User-Friendly Neuroscience. And I say this quite sincerely. I read it cover to cover, and I found it very helpful as a clinician, as a mental health consumer, as an educator. It's really good about helping people understand how the brain works versus how the mind works, and not to get sort of caught up too heavily in one or the other. It has a lot to do with helping people regulate their feelings. And Hannah, do you want to say just a little bit about what Potential Finders Network is and the Village Education and Growth Collective?
Yes, the Potential Finders was what I started with, and I've always named it network, even though I was the only person in the beginning, because I've always had a vision of having connections all over the place where people can refer to each other. It includes both my clinical practice, and before it was where I did my education, because I do training all over the country. A couple of years ago, I started a second kind of little
Hmm.
branch, The Village, which is also a collective. But now I'm part of a group of people who are trying to do therapeutic approaches differently, given, the state of the
Yeah.
world and people's finances and what have you. And so I would say The Village is sort of a branch of Potential Finders. It's the education and skills non-therapeutic, and then Potential Finders is more of the therapeutic approach.
It sounds like sort of trying to take mental health maybe and apply it more broadly in other ways, almost like a public health model, or it just sounds interesting what you were saying about. Yeah,
Thank you. Yeah, I think you could say that the village is more of a skills-based and peer groups and various things like that, education and skills, non-therapeutic, versus, the other one where I have research, therapy, the books I write, things like that.
got it. So you do see individual clients or patients in psychotherapy, and
Yes, I have a small group of people that I do very, very specific work. And so it keeps me in it to make sure that the things that I teach and write about are reflected in real life. And so, yeah, I have a small caseload.
I should mention that I met Hannah taking a course that she was teaching on neurobiology and affect regulation. Affect regulation is kind of therapist talk for soothing and attending to our moods in more adaptive ways. So we all have feelings of fear and anxiety or whatever, sadness, and how do we respond to them in a way that doesn't make it worse? Hannah, we were going to talk about some of the feelings and the emotional and perhaps even the neurobiology going on as we watch so much unfold politically and so much that seems so extreme, particularly to people, middle class white people who maybe haven't been exposed to it before. I wanted to actually start by I was reading, there's a podcaster and substacker named Stephen Robinson, and he goes by the Play Typer guy. And he was writing about the ICE agents who shot Alex Preddy dead. Their identity has been revealed, and it turns out that they are apparently Latino American men from South Texas. And so Stephen Robinson was saying in his column that it isn't just like whiteness or money. I mean, that's at one level, or nationality, but that it's power. I also tend to think spiritually as well as psychologically, but I think it's an attack on vulnerability. Somehow there's something that
Mhm.
feels intolerable about feeling vulnerable, about being human. And I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts along those lines, like what do you see going on in this horrible abuse of power that, yeah, takes the form of racial and political violence?
Oh my goodness. Where to
Wherever you like.
start? I find that you can look at it from the social lens and see some of the dynamics there. And the lens I often look through then is also the neuroscience lens. Yes, power, but I think the reason why we're seeing what we're seeing is a combination of sort of a what I would call a colonial capitalistic lens, money is all kind of
Mm-hmm.
thing. You're going to do the thing that you need to do in order to get the money for your family and what have you. I sort of think of it as kind of a layered thing. And at the very top, you would have some more of the structured, sort of systematic, programmatic, people going on that are setting sort of the tone, if I could say it
Mm-hmm.
that way. I could say more about it later, but for example, Christian nationalists, something called the NAR, various different people who have an
Mm-hmm.
agenda. And so they have a following and a belief system where power has a particular meaning. As you get farther down, I think it's kind of closer to being more capitalistic than it would be almost at the top,
Hmm.
because these folks up here at the top they're almost out of touch with all of that. You
You're
know what
sort of
I'm
talking
saying?
about these sort of billionaire Epstein Island sort of, yes, like
Yeah.
it's almost like
Yeah.
they're high. I mean, I'm not kidding, but it
Yeah.
is almost like they're totally
Mhm.
high. And we were talking earlier about sort of dopamine and what that really means. And you made a really interesting comment. But you're saying there's also a support base that allows that to happen. And there's a different experience
Yeah.
at that support base level.
I think so. It depends because, like I said, there's an overarching. I was looking earlier, I wrote down
Hmm.
some notes. I personally, just from my view, and I'm surely I don't see it all, but there's three main, say, categories of folks at the top is what I
Yeah.
might say. I'm sure there's
No,
more
no,
than
what's your, yeah.
three. And then the folks underneath that, if they buy into some of the things that are being taught there, then we have some followers, I would say. And then we have supporters, people who get something from it or whatever. I don't know necessarily like how clean cut it is. What I can say is, again, using the lens that I do, is that dynamics like this come about based on what I think of as mistakes of interpreting our own biological signals.
Which is a lot of what you write about and teach about. So let me back up. You said, if I heard you right, that there were sort of three clusters of people at the top. And can you
Mhm,
say what those
mhm.
three clusters are?
Yeah. Now, again, I'm looking through not just the neuroscience lens, but I do a lot of faith-based activism. And so I'm sure there are just pure folks who, want money
Yeah.
and don't have like a collective agenda. But the ones that I see for the most part would be Christian
Hmm.
nationalists, they're one group, something called the New Apostolic Reformation, which doesn't go by that name now. They're going to call themselves all kinds of other things, but trust they are all
Okay.
together.
Okay.
And then probably what I would call just the very fundamental conservative evangelical white
Hmm.
church per se. And so some of the differences, just to say, the Christian nationalists are not actually Christian. Like there's very little that has anything to do with the religion of Christianity with them.
Okay.
So you have them, which is a huge group. A better way of probably describing them is supremacist. They do have some overlap. They'll talk about the Bible, they might know a few scriptures or what have you. The other group, the evangelical Christian fundamentalists, they have a particular
Hmm.
lens they look through that is hierarchical, um, hierarchy, moralism, and literalism.
Hmm.
So the Christian nationalists have the moralistic and hierarchical, like there is a top echelon, usually a white
Yeah.
man, and then, like that. There's some overlap there. And then moralism, although the moralism, we have really seen a shift in what was like if you listen 10 years ago to some of the folks in the evangelical group, what they were saying was moralistically okay versus what the same people say today is vastly different. And there's a reason
Yeah.
for that. And then finally the NAR, which is more of what's called apocalyptic or dominionistic.
Which you did mention before, and I'm going to ask you to talk a little about it because I think a lot of people are not even familiar with the NAR. But can you
Hmm.
just say a little more about the shift in moralism, so-called moralism, between what it used to be versus what it is today? What's the difference?
Yes. So the primary group that's actually in the government that has several people in the cabinet and what have you are more of the NAR or Dominionists. And these folks believe that God's talking directly to
Mm.
them. And so I recently saw, I wish I could have thought to write down the name of who said it, a pastor who said, if you have a fact and you have something the Bible says and the two don't align, it's the fact that's wrong. So these folks get taught to just twist, 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 twist. And there's a couple of particular things that I could tell you about that get you there. But for example, if Trump is the man of God, God chose
Yeah.
Trump, then everything he does is right, and we have to twist everything else to fit. That's how it shifted, I believe.
That's fascinating. That involves a lot of cognitive distortion. Can you speak at a more individual psychological level about what's going on there and maybe how someone gets to that point?
Yes, and here's where we get some of the power dynamic along with those
Yes.
followers. Yes. So the leadership, they're heavy in the power dynamic. They're the, top echelon of the group, and they set the tone and what everybody can do and that sort of thing. Typically the followers in these groups are low
Mm.
socioeconomic background. A lot of them may have had, abuse or grew up in some of these very strict environments and what have you. So, for example, because I also come from a very
Yeah, I
similar
was going to ask about
background.
that. Yeah.
Yes, and I can remember looking back when I was younger. First of all, we're taught that we're bad and only good thing would be whatever God says. And so whenever you hear something, because there's a terrible dissonance, people know this stuff isn't okay. If you come from backgrounds that are distressed like that, having somebody that's very authoritative and telling you what to do and certainly full of
Yeah.
certainty and what have you can feel very comforting. But then if there's dissonance, like they say one thing and do
Mm.
another, or they advocate lying or any sort of thing, it's easy to say to yourself something like, "Oh, well, I'm probably not seeing the whole story here.
Mm.
It must
Hmm.
be me," because the sensations in the body that tell you something's
Yeah.
wrong, first of all, the body is thought of as bad, so we're not supposed to listen to our inner voices,
Wow. Okay. So the
right?
body gets
Yeah, and
gets
so it's very
dissociated.
easy.
Okay. Wow. Okay.
Oh,
That makes
yes.
total
Oh,
sense what
yes.
you're
Oh,
saying. Yeah.
yes. Yeah. And where you would see a lot of people in public, like if you look at Twitter or you look at any people having conversations out in public, they're going to be all for it. One of the things that now I look at is like so amazing is how a particular group of these folks are absolutely never ever ever wrong and
Mm.
have no accountability and it's
Mhm.
always correct. So outwardly that's what they'll present, but when they go back home, if they're in their churches, in their homes or something like that, I can almost guarantee you it's not that at all. They'll be bashing on each other, all sorts of
So
things.
there's that how they're interacting in the public sphere is very different than in the interpersonal sphere, which I think goes both
Yes.
ways as well, which is people say, but he's a nice guy, he's a good person. And yet there are some beliefs and some behaviors that are truly harmful.
Hmm.
You said something about the dissonance, which is the leader can never be bad. And what I thought of was a quote by the Scottish psychoanalyst W.R.D. Fairbairn, who said, "Children would rather imagine themselves devils in a world of angels than angels in a world of devils, because it's simply too
Hmm.
overwhelming with anxiety to believe otherwise." And so I'm thinking, from your perspective, what does it serve to make the leader never wrong? Is it like there's so much wounding from that distressing upbringing that, like, I need something here, kind of? Or what do you think?
What I think that is happening is that our amygdala and something called the HPA axis in our brain is kind of running our
Yeah.
lives. So the way I think about it is if you look at a lot of the discourse that happens, there's a lot of all or
Hmm.
nothing. So it's good, it's bad, there's no in between, there's no nuance. And that is a trauma
Hmm.
response. I personally think that the pandemic, I mean, this happening after
Yeah.
the pandemic makes total sense. So even if you didn't have a ton of people before, which you did, there were millions and millions of people connected to NAR that were on phone calls for hours and hours at a time leading up to January 6th, for
Yeah.
example. There's a lot of that going on. But if you didn't have that before, you certainly had that afterwards. Very polarizing, but I really think the polarization that we're seeing is trauma responding.
Mm.
Because if you come up to the grizzly bear, you don't want to stop and ask your prefrontal cortex, hey, what should I do? That part of your brain is only associative. And so it's good, bad, right, wrong, like a switch. And so they either have to be right or wrong. There is no ability to see the in between.
So this gets at both. I know you talk about this in your book, and I'm just going to do a little explanation, and please correct me for our listeners. The amygdala and the HPA axis and the limbic system are more associated with fast, emotional, reactive thinking. And as Hannah writes
Yes.
about in her book, our brain wants to do things efficiently and keep us safe. But as a result, it
Mhm.
doesn't always get it right. It may mistake perceived safety for actual safety. So it may perceive, for example, a loss of social standing or worrying about something in the
Mhm.
future, which I do all the time. But it's like, is that actually happening right now? Whereas the prefrontal
Mhm.
cortex is more associated with our executive functioning, our ability to
Mhm.
reason, what Freud would call the
Mhm.
ego. Like, what's going on here?
Mhm.
Can you say a little about what happens when there's that trauma? You get traumatized, there's PTSD. What's going on with this one system versus the other?
I would say the way you would want to break it up, because there's actually two ways to get anxious or to get the amygdala going. One is directly because the information comes into your body and goes into this area in the center of your brain called the
Hmm.
thalamus. And the thalamus decides where to distribute it. If the thalamus, which I call the Grand Central Station, already knows that it's a problem, it goes right to the amygdala and sets off the alarm. For example, you walk into a room and you jump out of the way of a pair of
Okay.
socks because you think it's a snake. You don't have it's very quick. It's 13
Mm.
milliseconds, but it could be a snake, in which case there's an issue. So the way I break it up is between threats to life and
Hmm.
limb versus threats to social standing or potential threats. The ones to life and limb are what our brain and body was kind of geared for to get us out of the way before we even really consciously know what's happening. But nowadays, let's say you're thinking about something. Let's say you walk into a room and you just broke up with someone. You walk into a party and there's several people there, and you all of a sudden decide this place is not safe. There's
Mm.
too many men. So your executive function can also set off that same defense response that's from the amygdala. and the HPA axis if it determines that you're not safe. The problem is there is no threat to life and limb. It's a social standing issue, but it sets off the amygdala, so either one feels the same. I do something called threat analysis to try to help people see what's actually happening in the moment and how you would respond in that case, because fight, flight, and freeze is not it.
Right.
You would do something
I
different.
think many people, for example, if they're feeling abandoned or ignored by a romantic partner, it can be very painful. However, it's not a threat to one's life and limb. But perhaps because it can activate infantile wounds or infantile abandonments in which it would be a threat to life and limb, the past is all of a sudden activated in the present, and there's all this control stuff going on.
Yes.
But Hannah, I want to get back
Yes.
to, I want to just apply something you're saying to the political world, which is, so let's take Barack Obama comes around, and he's the first black man to be president. It's a brown face with a non-Anglophone name. And it seems like there is this very fast, traumatic thinking coming up with all sorts of conspiracies and rage about him. I'm wondering if you see that sort of dynamic, this mistaking one for the other going on in the political world as well, or something like it. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. Actually, I would go all the way back to the Civil War and
Please.
before. I would say that if you look at what happened there in the Civil War, after that was over, yeah, we made sort of some attempts at, I don't know what, healing or something. But for generations, I mean, just look at how we talk about each other in our culture. We have an entire huge people group that have been, I don't know, teased, put down, just there was not enough repair work done after the Civil War. So one of the things that I do that can be difficult sometimes is I want people to be able to look at both sides, not necessarily because we're trying to build empathy and feel sorry for people, but to actually see how human beings work. And so we have folks, and if you look at sort of the again with some of the religious connotation and some of the twisting that happens, if you look at what happened as we're coming up to the Civil War, there were several mandates by big leaders in the church that would change things just a little so that slavery was okay, kind of
Really?
thing.
Okay.
Oh
Okay.
yeah, there were all kinds of things like that. And then after the Civil War, you have to think these people lost their homes, they lost their livelihood, they lost face, all sorts of things. And then, they tried some repair, but we moved into things like Jim Crow and all that sort of thing. But we know that we aren't supposed to talk in a certain way in public,
Right.
right? And so with the rugged individualism, and you take just the American way of exceptionalism, we're the best, we've heard our
Yeah,
whole
yeah, yeah.
lives. We're not supposed to talk in certain ways. So you have the Civil War and what happened after that, and the social justice, things happening in the 60s. And then in the mid to late 70s, that's when this group, you've heard of, I'm sure, of the moral
Of course.
majority. Have
Yeah,
you
yeah,
heard
yeah.
of that? There are recordings of them talking where they actually say, not maybe in these words, but they actually talk about how, well, we can't call it this segregation anymore. We have to talk this way. And again, they're putting out this information to help people make it okay to do what they're doing. So this is a lot. The whole point of saying that is, I'm not even sure I remember
No,
your
no,
first
no, no.
question, but the whole point of that is like, it's been a long time coming. So Obama, what
Yes.
that did, I mean, we've got these people that have under the surface been bearing this weight since the Civil War. And here all of a sudden is every single thing they've been told could never happen
Got it. Got
happening.
it.
And it just, blows things up. But here's the problem. They still can't say that until Trump comes along and gives them
And
permission.
opens the floodgates. Hannah, let's just say, just being somewhat fanciful here, but like wounded white post-Civil War white supremacist America, largely in the South, but not entirely. There's plenty of racism up north and
Mhm.
elsewhere. It just takes different forms. Comes
Sure.
into your office
Mhm.
and says, I feel horrible and despair. Or Obama gets elected. They come into your office and they say, I am so overwhelmed with feelings, which would be a good first step. What might you say if that were embodied in a person, a patient who actually wants some help? What would you say?
Well, I try to take a decolonial lens and look at the whole person. I use what's called interpersonal
Hmm.
neurobiology. So, and I can't really go into explaining all of that, but I will say that it's a non-pathologizing approach and it breaks the human complex system into what are called 9 domains of
Hmm.
integration. And one of them is temporal, temporal integration, so past, present, future, time, and then, of course, interpersonal, and then within the person, bilateral, meaning left and right side of the brain, and then, vertical, meaning the cognitive and the somatic structure. So,
Yeah,
anyway, I would see that person as within a context, right? So, that still whole story won't come out in the first session. This is
of
gonna take a
course.
while to put them into a context. But if the context became clear, here is a person who is a white supremacist who, has all these fears. My main approach, because it's not gonna be my job to tell them
Of
what to
course.
think or what have you, but to gently lead them by curiosity, real, genuine, because I 100% believe I can learn from anyone and be incorrect at any time. That I would ask them questions to lead to find where their pain came from and slowly introduce them to other elements that they might not be considering, like their history.
Hannah, as you talk, I think of an analogy that I would make is I have had people come to me because they're struggling with a compulsive behavior. For example, I'm viewing a lot of pornography. My partner doesn't like it. I can't stop. My partner doesn't like it. There's some part of me that doesn't like it, but I can't stop. I'm just this horrible person, but I also, and very often what we get to is like, oh, this was viewing pornography is how you learned to soothe yourself in a chaotic household. You had access to the internet or
Mhm.
whatever. So actually, you were pretty creative.
Mhm.
It's hard to be human, and you were learning. And then you started to associate certain behaviors with the anxiety before you even knew you were anxious. And
Yeah.
so those
Mhm.
neural pathways get buried deep and early. But to sort of, like
Mhm.
you're saying, this non pathologizing, like I almost wish I could say to sort of, I don't know, the sorts of people we're talking about, kind of like, there's a reason why this happened. And rather than
Mhm.
evoke shame and tell you what you're doing wrong, let's just understand where it comes from and how to heal. I'm
Mhm.
wondering if we can, on that note, could you maybe talk a little about your own personal story and what you came through and how it impacts your work? Whatever you're comfortable with talking about and stuff.
Yeah, sure. I'm an only child, and both of my parents had some pretty significant mental health issues. My mother was
Mm.
schizoaffective, bipolar type, and my father had PTSD. Of course, those things are in retrospect based on what I know now. Um, I ended up in foster care when I was around 12. My parents divorced, and then I ended up in foster care. And around that time, I had a boyfriend because why not? And I was by myself. And he was in a big accident, And so I went to his church to get a card signed. And it turns out that this little group of people was a cult, but they were very nice in the beginning, and so I kind of got sucked in. So I was in there by myself without my dad, and I was in there for about 15 years. And I guess the easiest way I've explained what the group was like, that most people have some understanding of. There's a documentary called Shiny Happy
Oh, yeah.
People. If you take those people and you mix them with the folks over in Waco and David
Wow.
Koresh, we were pretty much like that, except we didn't stockpile weapons, but we did just about everything else. We were communal. There's elements of a lot of what I see here, but we were very like fringe. But we did do a lot. We had a private school, and we had some of Bill Goddard's, whatever his last name is. I think it was either Goddard or Gothard. I'm not really sure, but he's the guy who was sort of running that whole
Okay.
group. He had materials and things for schools. And so we had some of that. And so I was in there for about 15 years, and it was because I lived with my dad, I did escape some of the particular kinds of abuses that were there. But I was 28 years old when I left, and I didn't know how to choose toilet paper in the grocery store or what cereal was right. It was bad.
So, first of all, it sounds like another way to refer to a cult is a high control group. That's the
Thank
yeah,
you.
yeah,
Yes. Yes. And I'm glad you said that, because so many people are calling all kinds of things cults
right.
today. And, I'm a little bit older, and I studied like 30 years ago, and we called it spiritual abuse and cults and things. But high control groups are so much a better term, because it's not just religion that has those.
Not at all.
But where I was at was very high control.
Can I ask what led to your leaving, and what kind of mental work did you have to do to survive?
While I was there, you mean?
Well,
What did I have
let me
to
just.
do?
I
Or
tend
to
to ask
leave?
two questions at once, which I really shouldn't do.
I do that all the time.
What led to your leaving? If you feel like discussing it.
Oh, there was a series of things, and it was, quite miraculous if you ask
Yeah,
me.
yeah.
But I was living in the house with the leader of the group and another family, and everyday life was just
It was.
torturous. And then the internet. I was rebellious because I kept going to school. School was my like safety net. And I guess just to make it really succinct, what I would say is, when I was in college, and this is interesting because I was a Cupric superconductor fabricator in the physics
Wow.
department at San Jose State. I was getting a physics degree. I had already finished others. I was just continuing school because it was my safe
Yeah,
place.
yeah.
Yeah. And so while I was in that department in solid state physics, I got nominated for something called the Ronald E. McNair
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Scholars. And one of the things our pastor always taught, and I learned to manipulate. So I used his own stuff against him. And he said, if it's free, it's from God. And I was given the opportunity to go on some college tours for free.
Uh-oh.
So I was able to go, and it was, I would say, would be one of the first steps, was that I was in a hotel room with another girl, and she was very sweet and kind, and she prayed in the morning. And I had always been taught that there were no one else but us, like 45, because one of the beliefs we had is in that all of human history, there was only going to be 144,000 people who ever made it to
Yes.
heaven.
Okay. And this
Yeah.
person in your hotel room, she was not part of your group,
Not
but
part of
she
my
had this
group.
spiritual life anyway. Okay.
Yes. And so that started me kind of questioning. I'd already felt, of course, so much dissonance for
Of
years,
course.
but I was able to do that little quick twisty thing about how it had to be me that was wrong, right? I always
Which
assumed
I want to
that.
ask you a question about, but I'll just make a note of it. But here you have this experience. It's interesting because it just shows me why authoritarian regimes, whether they are a family, a community, or a country are inconsistent with open speech and open thought. You can't have you
Yes.
going out and learning about the world, learning about science, physics, other kinds of spirituality. You're going to have to twist more and more and more. And so let me ask this. Actually, I
Hmm.
can ask the question. There has to be some kind of mechanism to compensate for all of that mental twisting. Like I'm thinking symptoms, or
Oh,
what do you
yeah.
see either with people you work with or just observing? Like, where does all that mental energy go? Because it takes a lot to lock down what some part of us knows is the truth.
Yes. Well, our brains have amazing filters. If you've ever, like, say, gone on vacation and there's a train nearby, after a day or two, you're not going to hear the
Mm,
train. The train is
yeah,
pretty loud and it's still there, number one. So brain filters things
totally.
out. Number two, you ever seen somebody, a car you've never seen before, and now suddenly they're everywhere, but they were always there
Yes.
and you never saw them before. So your brain filters, we all live in a little bit of delusion,
True.
but the house of cards delusion that you have to have, I believe that a tremendous amount of what ends up happening is a kind of a psychological deflection, in a sense, like, okay, I have the leader here and he's saying these things and life is just too, because I'm horrible, it's awful, I have to make some sort of sense about it because I'm also being told that God is loving. So
Yeah.
what does that mean?
Right.
And so you end up kind of beating on yourself and terrible shame. I just thought, like, I was drowning in shame
Shame.
before
Yes.
and
Yes.
uncertainty. I would say I was book smart and people dumb is how I would talk about it because I
Mm-hmm.
always did very well in school and I loved physics even then. But we were so fringy and odd that the typical stuff you would see about science, that wasn't an issue there, and it was also the '80s, and so they just saw it as me getting a teaching degree, which I wasn't, but they
Right.
didn't understand it at the
It's funny,
time.
they put it in their own
So
box
you
rather than saying, Hannah might be learning about bigger truths and other ways of thinking out there. But it
Mhm,
went to like, she's
mhm,
getting yeah,
mhm.
and I think we all can relate
Yes,
to that at some level.
yes. And it set me on this course, and then I met people online because we had, it was just back in the day of the internet starting out, and there were chat
Sure.
rooms, and I would stay up all night and just talk to people all over the country. I was
Wow.
so achingly
Yeah.
lonely. And there's just, like, a whole bunch of things that happened, and eventually I realized something here isn't right. So even though I left, I went to a local church, which back then they called spiritual adultery. But I went to get help because I thought I was just I just had to talk to
Totally.
someone, and they helped me leave, but it was probably a good 2 years after that before I stopped the narrative of, "They're okay, it's me that's wrong," and then started to really realize, because here's the
Mhm.
thing, this is what I teach a class on some resistance. Why do we resist? I like the question, what would that person have to admit in order to agree with me right now?
Mm.
And you have to think about all the things that I would be saying to myself if I admitted that they were wrong. That's part of what's going on right now, because what would happen if your average Trump supporter admitted he was wrong right now? What would they also
Well,
have
can
to
you give
admit?
us a sense of what would come along with that house of cards?
Oh, yes. They would have to admit that they have not only learned things incorrectly, but their beliefs have been harmful to other
Mm.
people. They have harmed people. They have to admit that they might lose their jobs, their friends. They have to admit that, oh my gosh, my belief that this guy is put there by God, is God wrong? Is he wrong? Were the people who told me that
Yeah.
wrong? What? I mean, it is psyche breaking. It's
It's a nervous
just
breakdown
a
in
lot.
the waiting. And I think this is true just, we're talking about sort of Trump supporters versus people who are horrified by what's going on, and that's important.
Mhm.
And also, I think this applies to all of us being human, like the things that I look, police violence Yeah, it was sort of an abstract problem to me, but as a sort of middle class white person, I was not facing it. Now that I see people being taken off the street and people being shot, and, like all of a sudden it feels very present and I'm involved
Hmm.
and I have to get involved because I see it as something that affects me. And I can also think of,
Hmm.
ancestors of mine who were affected by the Holocaust. And I'm like, gosh, I wish somebody would have spoken up then. More people would have spoken up. Hannah, I want to be mindful of the time, but I wanted to ask you, can you give us a little sense of what were some of the important things that you did in the deconditioning and the building the bridge to the larger world, which obviously you're still continuing to do, but yeah, what was really important for you? What was particularly central?
Well, I think I've always been somebody who was willing to be humble and learn, but I think changing like having the ability to actually listen to myself and connect to my body, that took a long
Hmm.
time. I mean, there's no playbook and certainly nobody told me anything. I went through a whole lot after I left. The first 3 or 4 years were just really self-destructive, and I had a lot of self-destructive behaviors and relational problems. Until a certain point, I actually ran off and lived in India
Wow.
for a while, and some stuff
Yeah.
happened there. Uh, when I made the decision, when the pain got so bad in my life, and I didn't think that I would live through it if I didn't do something, I got very serious and I studied the brain and the body
Ah.
because I knew something, but I could, like you said earlier, I wanted to change, but I couldn't. Once I started recognizing the mechanisms of how things work, the magic really happened for me when I was able to separate my character from my biology and recognize that a lot of my behaviors were coming from the chemical wash in my body and not from my
Which
character.
is totally
That
what
makes
you write
sense.
about. And it's interesting. Now I
Hmm.
can see like you're this person who is very interested in science. And I think that we start with what our strong points are. We go with what's closest. And it's funny, my own kind of spiritual awakening, I was in a lot of pain in the early 2000s, and a lot was going on and a lot of trauma I hadn't dealt with. I had mental illness in my family too. And 9/11 happened. And that was kind of my COVID. But I like to read. And a friend of mine used to send me like self help books. And I was like, God, another stupid self help book. And this friend of mine sent me The Power of Now by Eckhart Tolle. And it was like the gateway drug.
Mm.
I was in so much pain that I was like, this is dumb. There's like big print and it's not a real book. And then I'd sort of crack it open and like read a few pages and I'd be like, huh, uh,
Hmm.
all right, I hope nobody in graduate school sees me reading this, but I am going to continue to read it. So yeah, you're this like brainy smart kid and so you go to science and the brain and that's what starts to kind of open the door for you. I wanted
Hmm.
to say as you were talking about when we have to begin to admit what we thought was true but isn't. I think there's a
Hmm.
really existential feeling of dread for many people. And underneath it
Hmm.
is tremendous feelings of what I would call grief. And I think people find grief
Hmm.
terrifying, almost more terrifying than
Mhm.
shame. The shame is more
Mhm.
conscious, but the grief is unconscious. If I give up what I thought about myself, my world, my country, my family, my president, my belief system, there's
Mhm.
grief.
Mhm.
And I love that you
Mhm.
talk about the body and the brain. Can you correlate that feeling of grief or feeling overwhelmed by it or not? How would that correlate to the brain or to neurobiology, if at all?
Again, if we have interpreted something as unsafe, whether it's grief or shame or
Ah,
something, we are going to want to get away from it, shove it down, repress, any of those
anesthetize.
things. Mhm. And loss is just one of those things, and especially because of all the pieces of loss, because we tend to think of, death and, maybe the loss of a job or a loved one, but there's so many, unsubstantiated pieces of, like, loss of sense of self, security, all these
Mm.
different things. I also, because I'm an interpersonal neurobiologist, recognize that we are all connected to everything. And it's like pulling the string, like, where does it end? When I admit a loss, what does that leave me? I have a gaping
Right.
hole, and that's not okay. That's terrifying.
Yeah,
And so I'm going to shut that down and busy myself
totally.
or, yeah, do other things to
To
manage it,
distract.
you
Yeah.
know.
And by the way,
Hmm.
a
Hmm.
Buddhist or a yogi would say, actually, there's really nothing underneath it. Try to make friends with that. That's a big ask.
Yeah.
But I would say at a more mental health level, perhaps to help children and younger people feel okay with grief and change and differentiating between healthy shame versus, say, you're carrying somebody else's shame, so that we're not running away from it and projecting it onto others and hurting them. Does that make sense what
Hmm.
I'm saying? Does that? Yeah.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, I really think that relationship is key. Now, it's funny because relationship doesn't actually have to be another
Okay.
person. It can be animals, it can be nature, it can actually be I remember when I came back from India, I didn't know anyone and I was just so lonely and I realized that my audiobooks were my friends,
Yeah.
something that is reflecting back to because we're not in isolation. I can't remember, and I know it gets quoted wrong, but Einstein talked about the delusion of separateness or something that
Absolutely.
we have.
Absolutely.
We aren't separate. And so I'm not sure without some sort of mirror reflecting us, because if you notice, like, the delusion that we're living in right
Mhm.
now, it's grown because there are groups
Yeah.
supporting it. This is a social issue as well as an individual psychological issue, because I would be willing to guarantee you, bet just about anything, if you were able to pick any person who is supporting, sounding bizarre to
Yeah.
us, if you got them alone and was able to get to the truth, they don't believe what they're saying a lot of the time either. They just know that it has to be said.
That's so interesting, and maybe that's a kind of jumping off point for thinking about how to deal with the present moment, how to think about it, because it is like we're all like separate trees, but our root systems are all connected too, and below the
Yeah.
surface. Yeah,
If I can give one quick
please,
little
absolutely.
example to
Yeah, yeah,
help
yeah.
with the whole development of where we are now with these religious groups that came together, there was a person named Lance
Hmm.
Wallnau a few years back came up with something called the Cyrus
Ooh,
anointing. It's social and it's story. The brain has to have story,
yeah,
right? The mind and the human has to have story. And so looking at Trump, there would have been no way that any Christian person would have been like, okay. But there's a person in the book of Ezra in the Bible whose name is Cyrus, who wasn't part of the, children of God at the time. And, God used him. So what happened was this person, Lance Wallnau, said Trump has the Cyrus anointing.
oh,
And now people are joined and have a story to point to help them see why they are wrong. Does that make sense? So he's acting like this, and you'll hear people say things like, well, God can draw a straight line with a crooked stick or whatever, in order to give them some branch to hold on to that a whole bunch of people can say, yeah, well, Lance said that. I know it looks weird, but, God's ways are higher than ours, and he's got the Cyrus anointing. And so even now they're able to spin based
and
on
does the
that.
Cyrus anointing mean like we are legitimate kind of heirs to the kingdom, but we're sort of the lost heirs, but we
No, so what they're saying is Cyrus was a king God used to do something but wasn't part
oh,
of God's people. So Trump isn't really, don't have to worry about the fact that Trump is bad and icky and not really acting Christian. That's okay because he has the Cyrus
he's getting us
anointing.
he's a tool in God's larger
Yes.
picture. Yeah. And so that's the kind of massive delusion that can be weaponized effectively with a mob in the grip of their groupthink. The Astor Place Theater riot involved a lot of both groupthink, mob thinking, and also another group projecting, caricaturing their opponents as just a mob, a thoughtless mob. So both things are going on. There's groupthink, there's mob think, and then there's accusations of mob think. But can you maybe speak a little bit in whatever way, whether it's neurobiological, social, when people are in a group, they're in that kind of, whether it's January 6th or whatever it is, the mobs, the groups, what's going on for people as you see it?
I still would say that we've got that trauma-based, all or nothing. We are right, they are wrong. We have this, goal or this higher calling or whatever the thing is that's leading us. And we're backed by this group of people who are seeing things the same way we are. And I don't know how much you know about C.S. Lewis, but he wrote a book called The Four Loves, and he talks about different kinds of love. And philia, for example, the friendship love or what have you, one of the cool things about it is that it like doubles whatever you are, but it can go in either
Yes.
direction. So in other words, if you're thinking like, oh, I could never go to school, but you have a friend going, yeah, you can. Now you have yours and them together. But if you also have a friend that goes, hey, you could rob the bank, you could also go that way. So it
Yes.
fortifies who you are. So I don't like the contagion idea so much, as I think of it more as social fortification, that I've got this troop that says you're headed in the right direction and we are the correct ones. And they are the bad guys. There's a book that just came out recently that's awesome. It's called Contamination and the Life of God. And it talks about the idea of something called disgust theology, and this idea that they're the bad ones and they need to be expelled and we're the good ones. And all of that is that when we get signals in our body that something's wrong or inconsistent, we get a little burst of adrenaline to kind of push us. We could believe our brain, but we don't have to. We could say, oh, I'm not used to seeing that, but there's nothing unsafe about that, and move on. But when we're fortified, especially in a frenzy and we're in, fight or flight, we're not thinking that way. And if you've got 20 other people doing the same thing, you're just not going to ask. You're just going, at that point, you're not connected to the higher functions of your brain. You're just on fight, flight, freeze, get rid of the mostly fight in that sense.
I have to imagine that there's something very adaptive about saying, oh, this other person is doing X, therefore X is okay. And it is amazing that, like nobody was saying things before Trump started saying them. Then it became okay. And then sort of now we're beginning to see like Zoran Mamdani saying things and like, wow, that's okay. Like it really does go both ways. And there must be something adaptive about it. As social beings, we must look to others. And at the same time, and I really love what you're saying about the body gives us signals. And if we are trained over and over again to ignore those signals, I think that we eventually stop even knowing that they're there. They're still there. They're still pulsing, but we stop knowing that they're there. And I think, I'm not the first person to think this, but I think that energy is going to come out some other way. It's going to try to make itself known because it's a truth,
Yes.
and the more we can be aware of it, like, oh, wait a minute, something doesn't feel right about this situation. And it's extra
Yes,
hard when there's
yes.
a lot of social voices around. Think how hard it is to be a nonconformist, to say, I'm not going to do that,
Well, that's why I think people who are queer and neurodivergent are probably going to really help save us here if we listen to them, or
Totally.
diversity in general,
Absolutely.
right, can be very helpful in that respect, for
Yeah.
sure. Yeah, I think we just not only don't listen, we sometimes listen too much to what I always say, a couple of little cute things, don't mistake dopamine for the Holy Spirit, and don't put your brain in charge of your life.
Can you just maybe we'll end on that. Dopamine, for those who aren't familiar, is commonly called like the pleasure chemical in our brain. We do cocaine or whatever, we have a donut, dopamine, versus serotonin, which is more of a mood regulator. But we maybe misapprehend what dopamine actually does. When you say, don't mistake dopamine for the Holy Spirit, like just because it feels great doesn't mean that's God talking to you.
Yes, well, it's a reward chemical that tells you what you just did was good, do it again.
Okay, so
That's what dopamine does often, which is why we'll seek out whatever the thing is. It's not necessarily always a pleasure feeling. It's yep, you're in the right direction. And I just want to say all of this is ancient. We don't need it in the same way socially anymore. The going after things the way that we
So
do.
if dopamine is a reinforcer and what B.F. Skinner and behaviorists would call operant conditioning, I did this, do it again. Wow, feels good. Good result, do it again.
Yeah. Yeah.
What was ancient about that? Why would that have served ancient persons?
Well, I mean, if we were in small tribal groups that were being chased by animals or something, when the leader runs, run, that makes sense. But the social dangers, supposedly, for the most part, that we face these days are not the same kind.
Right.
Like I said, it's not threats to life and limb. It's being analyzed by the front brain and still setting the amygdala off. That does not need to happen
In other
anymore.
words, if my date says, it was nice to meet you, but I don't want to go out again, that's not the same as being ripped to pieces by a saber-toothed tiger.
Exactly, but it feels that way in the
Exactly. And
body.
then it gets reinforced culturally and socially.
Yes, which is why we don't want to admit when we make
Ugh.
mistakes, because we're still thinking that will be chucked out and all that ancient junk in there that's just not
Yeah, and
true.
some people are raised that way and conditioned that way, probably because the parent themselves
Mhm.
have not realized, like, it's actually, you're going to make mistakes, you're going to get disappointed, that's life, but it's not being ripped apart by a
No.
saber-toothed tiger.
No, and then you use our culture that says we're the best and all
Oh,
that. I mean, yeah, it's just all kinds of stuff in there that makes it hard. That reinforces that. Believe the brain when it says there's a danger.
exactly. Human beings. Boy,
Right?
Hannah, thank you so much. Yeah, I could feel like I could talk for like many more hours. And
I know. I feel like I went
no,
all
no,
over the place. I'm not sure what
no,
I
no.
said.
You said a lot of really wonderful things. All right, Hannah Smith, thank you so much. And we'll put this in the show notes. You can contact Hannah at Hannah, Hannah, at potentialfinders.com or Hannah at thevillageegc.com, whichever you prefer. And her book is Lasting Change. All right, I hope you feel a little better after our sort of therapy session there with Hannah Smith. I, for one, feel better. It may also help you to know that Joshua and I are working on season 2 of Feel Familiar, Emotionally Intelligent History. It's going to look closely at something men do when they feel safe, comfortable, and secure in their power, which is get into drag and put on shows. From ancient Greece to Renaissance to vaudeville to a craze called womanless weddings, which were huge among prominent men in the American Deep South in the 1910s and the 1920s. And no, I'm not kidding. So stay tuned. In the meantime, take good care.
There's more to history than what you've been taught. History repeats, it may or may not. Time's got baggage, we all do. Erdman's here to walk us through what, when, where, how, who. Feel familiar? Crack the spine, a times-old script. We're diving in where the facts have slipped. It's history told with wit and care, with roasts and guests, no thoughts to spare. Who, what, why, how, where. Feel familiar?